Anger and deadly violence in Iran escalate despite tough warnings from the country's supreme leader. But as the protests continue, what do reformists want exactly? What will become of their movement? And can they shake the foundations of the Islamic revolution? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Lauren Taylor. Protests have continued on the streets of Iran. At least 10 people were killed over the weekend. That brings the total to at least 30 since the announcement that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad had been re-elected president over a week ago. Protesters have been clashing with police at rallies for the presidential candidate Mir Hossein Mousavi. They claim the reformist leader was cheated out of the presidency and are demanding that the election results be annulled. Both pro-reform and pro-Ahmadinejad supporters demonstrated in the wake of the election results. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has called for an end to the protests, but they've continued unabated. Well, it's difficult to gain accurate information about what's happening inside Iran. Much of the television footage available to the outside world is amateur, often streamed on the internet due to the strict limits put on state and international media. And now the BBC says their permanent correspondent in Tehran has been asked to leave. Well, in a statement on his website, Mousavi said he did not seek confrontation with the authorities. In his words, "We are not against the Islamic system and its laws, but against lies and deviations, and just want to reform it." Well, Iran still claims to be a state undergoing Islamic revolution, and supporters of Mr. Mousavi aren't necessarily denouncing those Islamic principles. Despite protests turning violent, what they're actually supporting is a change from within, headed by Mir Hossein Mousavi, leader of the reform movement. That movement began after presidential elections in 1997. The cleric Mohammad Khatami won an unexpected landslide victory. He'd campaigned for greater democracy and rights for women. He also won a second term, but Khatami's time as president has been criticised by some. Under his more liberal presidency, many newspapers were opened, but were then forced to close by the higher regime, which left some saying that he was not as effective a reformer as he'd promised. Khatami was succeeded by Conservative Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in 2005, after neither of the reformist candidates made it into the final stage of voting. This year, reformist Mousavi said if elected, he would review restrictions on women and freedom of the media. He even suggested disbanding the morality police, but all from within the existing Iranian government structure. Well, to discuss all this, our guest today in London, Mehrdad Konsari, former Iranian diplomat and senior consultant to the Centre for Arab and Iranian Studies. Also in London, Ali Granmaye, former Iranian diplomat and senior research fellow at the London Middle East Institute. And in Washington, D.C., Kenneth Katzman, a specialist in Persian Gulf affairs for the Congressional Research Service. If I could go to London first and Mehrdad Konsari, this seems to be now more about the authority of the supreme leader, doesn't it?
Yes, well, I think the supreme leader has put his credentials on the line. He has spoken, he has issued his verdict, and essentially and effectively his verdict has been rejected by both Mr. Mousavi and the protesters who took to the streets of Tehran yesterday. This is a significant departure from any scenario that we have seen in Iran all these years, and Mr. Mousavi has had to make probably the most difficult choice of his entire political career, because there is no way that he can ingratiate himself or go back to the position that he enjoyed within the ruling establishment, no matter what happens. And so we are faced with a new scenario.
OK, Ali Granmaye, if I could bring you in on that point, given that the confrontation that they've established between the two sides, do you think the reformist movement needs to push it all the way and have the supreme leader replaced?
At the moment, they are not struggling for it. And as we know, Mr. Mousavi was part of the system. He was one of the selected candidates, and his candidacy was approved by the Council of Guardians. So he wanted to fight, to campaign within the framework of the Islamic Republic's constitution. So they are not, they didn't mention in their slogans by now that they are looking for that type of change. They want just to change the direction, to be more open to the world, to be more liberal in introduction of Islamic law in Iranian society. So I doubt if Mr. Mousavi is pursuing that objective you mentioned.
Kenneth Katzman, if I could bring you in, I mean, clearly, as was just stated there, he was very much a part of the regime. How much of a reformist would he be, even if he did get into power?
Well, first let me say I'm not speaking on behalf of Congress or anybody in Congress. I'm here personally as an expert. But Mousavi, you know, he's had a mixed record. He was actually part of part of the group within the regime in the early stages during the Iran-Iraq War, which was actually somewhat repressive and wanted to control the economy, etc. So he's really not totally in the mold of Khatami, Mohammad Khatami, even though Khatami endorsed him. So you know, if he were to win, if he had won the election, it's not clear that he would be dramatically different. And he would have faced the same constraints that Khatami faced, which is the Council of Guardians, the Assembly of Experts, the Expediency Council, the Supreme Leader would have constrained what he would seek to do, and he would have the same problems as a reformist president in the midst of you know, a fairly conservative Islamic system.
Mehrdad Konsari, if I could just bring it back to the sort of the confrontation that's established between Khamenei, I should say, the supreme leader, and Mousavi and the protesters. How much, I mean, how surprised were you to see that people were prepared to challenge the authority of the supreme leader in this way?
Well, I don't think that, I mean, it's very difficult to say because I was surprised and I was not surprised. Let's put it this way. The fact is that the conditions within the country have been ready for some kind of expression of public discontent for a very long time. When you have 25% plus inflation, 30% unemployment, no respect for human values and human rights, these things get bottled up and have to let themselves go at some stage. But the fact is that making that first step, I think the straw that broke the camel's back was essentially the fact that people tried to move within the system to exhibit their grievances against the system, not by challenging the system, but trying to play within the games, within the rules set by the system. And once turned down, they saw that, you know, that they had no choice but to exhibit their protests in, you know, in this fashion. So I am surprised at the fact that they did it in the sense because they overcame their fears and their intimidations and their inhibitions. But I'm not surprised that they should want to do it because they've been wanting to do this for a hell of a long time.
Ali Grenmeier, would you agree with that? Sort of wanting to express this in this way? Would you agree with the last speaker?
I had the same perception before the election day that it would be a free and fair elections between these four candidates, and I saw no reason to think that Mr. Mousavi would be denied his legitimate right and ballot boxes would be filled for Mr. Ahmadinejad. I thought it would not be against the continuity if Mr. Mousavi or anybody else out of those four replaced Mr. Ahmadinejad, or it would be such a big disappointment for the people.
But are you saying that
who went?
Yeah, I mean, are you saying that actually
please.
are you saying that the continuity is needed, or are you saying that it's not? I'm not quite clear.
You know, continuity, I mean continuity of the regime, continuity of the Islamic Republic, continuity of the leadership of Ayatollah Khamenei. And Mr. Mousavi's election would not violate those principles. So I didn't think that the result of election would be such disappointing for the people who rushed to the ballot boxes and showed an exceptional approach towards the election, which was exceptional since the beginning of the Islamic regime 30 years ago.
Kenneth Katzman, there's a lot of talk about some of the clerics or some of the battles that are going on behind the scenes and the role of Hashemi Rafsanjani, who's the leader of the Assembly of Experts, which in theory has the power to depose or get rid of the supreme leader. How much of it is, you know, a kind of a power play that's going on behind the scenes that we're not really seeing?
Well, I think that's what it's become. I think in the protest movement started out as a protest against what was perceived as election fraud. It's still unclear whether there was widespread fraud or not. There were certainly some irregularities, but it's now morphed, it's evolved really into a power struggle with Mousavi, Khatami, and Rafsanjani aligned against the Supreme Leader, the Council of Guardians, to some extent the majority in Parliament, and the Majlis is conservative also, and some of these other bodies, and Revolutionary Guards, security forces, etc. So I think that's what it's become. Now, I would say it was interesting that Mousavi yesterday did not appear to join these protests, and he seems to be shrinking back a little bit from confrontation, which suggests that there is a narrowing of this protest movement to the really hardcore elites in Tehran, urban educated intellectuals who are really very much against Ahmadinejad, very much against the Islamic system as it's evolved.
Okay, let me bring in Mehrdad Konsari on that point. I mean, what is the demographic of the reformist movement? Is it simply in the cities, or does it feature in the countryside and elsewhere in Iran?
No, I think I think that when you talk about reform, you're talking about openness in society. That is something that is desired by the majority of the Iranian population, whether they're in cities or elsewhere. The youth that people speak so much about, people who are age 30 or under, constitute 70% of the population. Now, of the total population of Iran, which is around 70 million, about 70% live in 6 major cities. So the fact is that you cannot say people's aspirations are different if they live in urban areas or rural areas. Their traditional behavior may be different, but they all want a better life. They all want stability, hope for a better future for their children and for their children's children and so on. Now, what has been missing is the fact that given the narrowness of the interpretation of various matters and policies and the dictates of the state, Iran's economic life has become subdued. Its role in the international community has become more isolated, and chances of improving their quality of life has decreased. This has been a gradual decrease which has taken place over the last 30 years, but it has become exacerbated under Ahmadinejad. Now, these are the issues. So you can't say that, that whether people in countryside have less aspiration for a better future than those in the cities, but those in the cities exhibit it more and are able to sort of catch the international eye much more readily than those in the rural areas.
Ali Granmaya, can I bring you in on that? I mean, is this, how widespread do you think, given the constraints that it's very difficult to get information or reliable information out of Iran, how widespread do you think the movement is?
I think dissent and dissatisfaction with Mr. Ahmadinejad's policy is widespread across the country. You mentioned possibility of difference between the rural area and urban areas. I can tell you that the people of rural areas have their own representatives in urban areas because their children are students in high schools and universities in cities, and those students who are arrested, most of them are from countryside rather than major cities. I can tell you that during this past 4 years, all major professional groups all major social groups were dissatisfied with policies of the government. You could see that the Iranian teachers associations had sit-ins in front of parliament about their legitimate rights. The Iranian students suffered during this period. Iranian women who are campaigning for elimination of discrimination against their rights, and it is called 1 million signature campaign. Their leaders were arrested and they were harassed even at their homes. And the only free trade union of Iran, the trade union, the syndicate of the workers of Tehran Transport, their leaders are in prison and their organization disbanded. So who are Iranians? They are either workers, they are teachers, they are women, they are students, and you could see all of them are dissatisfied with policies of the past 4 years under President Ahmadinejad.
Okay, let's move on now to look at some of the international reaction that there's been to this, because clearly the outcome and the fallout from these Iranian elections is primarily a matter for Iranians themselves, but the international community has responded to events, sometimes somewhat reluctantly.
It's not productive, given the history of U.S.-Iranian relations, to be seen as meddling, the U.S. president meddling in Iranian elections. What I will repeat, and what I said yesterday, is that when I see violence directed at peaceful protesters, when I see peaceful dissent being suppressed, wherever that takes place, it is of concern to me and it's of concern to the American people.
Well, the French President Nicolas Sarkozy was perhaps more blunt and clear when he said the extent of the fraud is proportional to the violent reaction. He also praised the Iranian protesters.
C'est aux Iraniens de choisir leur gouvernement.
It belongs to the Iranian people to choose their own government. But we can be nothing but preoccupied by the violence of the Iranian election reaction and the courage of the Iranian people who went down onto the street to ask for the right to choose freely what their future will be.
The British Prime Minister Gordon Brown called for Iran to listen to its people and to prove the elections were not rigged.
And it is for Iran now to show the world that the elections have been fair. It is also for Iran to show the world that the repression and the brutality that we've seen in these last few days is not something that is going to be repeated.
Well, the various responses from the international community triggered a sharp response from Iran's Supreme Leader, Khamenei, in a speech he delivered on Friday. He attacked foreign powers for questioning the election results. German Chancellor Angela Merkel responded to that and urged for a transparent examination of the results.
Today's speech of Khamenei, from my point of view, was disappointing. I think it is very important that the vetoes made concerning the results of the elections need to be investigated, and we hope for justice in Iran that it will be possible within the next few days.
On Sunday, President Ahmadinejad accused the West of trying to discredit Iran. He particularly singled out the US and Britain, accusing them of interfering in Iran's affairs. Can I go back to Kenneth Katzman in Washington? That allegation is always going to be there. Whatever, if someone says anything against what Iran is doing, the allegation is there that there's interference. How do you get around that problem?
Well, really, you don't. It's very, very difficult. President Obama has tried to get around it by being very careful not to make any judgments as to whether the election was fraudulent or not, but saying, it needs to be investigated. It's for the Iranian system to investigate it. Been very careful not to give Khamenei and Ahmadinejad any excuse to blame the United States, although they have obviously blamed the United States, and especially Britain. I think what was very novel about Khamenei, the Supreme Leader's Friday prayer speech on Friday, was the vitriol he directed against Great Britain, which goes back to historic post-revolution statements indicating that Britain is really the brains behind all the conspiracies against Iran over the years. And I think the British called in the Iranian representative in London to complain about this. So that was, it also suggests Khamenei maybe does not want to tangle with the United States and maybe sees President Obama as very much different from President Bush and somebody that maybe down the road Iran could do business with at some point.
Mehrdad Konsari, on that point, can I bring you in? I mean, is that, do you think what's happening, that both sides are trying to keep the options open? In Obama's case, he wants to maybe have the potential for negotiations down the line, and perhaps the Supreme Leader also recognises that he doesn't want to alienate the Americans?
I don't quite see it that way. I think that there is no doubt in the mind of the Supreme Leader, and as well as really anybody who has followed Iran very closely, that the Americans and the Europeans, the majority of the Arabs and Israel would have preferred to have seen Mr. Mousavi win, if only for the fact that his accession to the presidency would have changed the tone and body language of Iranian politics and would have awarded more time for the United States, for whom Iran is not the main priority at this stage. They have Afghanistan, Pakistan. If they take their eyes off of Iraq, things could deteriorate. So all of these things led them to believe that they would have preferred the Mousavi presidency. Now, that has not happened. The Americans, I think...
Yeah, I was going to bring in Ali Granmaye at that point. I mean, do you think that the influence of other powers can ever help the reformists, or is it always going to be a hindrance to them in that it can immediately be interpreted as, you know, foreign interference in Iranian affairs?
I think the question of human rights and observation of human rights and violation of human rights is not a question of meddling in internal affairs of any country, because it is above the domestic issues of any country. It is a global concern. Now the people's right was ignored, and the government, security services and militia are using repressive measures against the peaceful civilians who are demonstrating for their basic law, their basic rights, constitutional rights. So I think that the concern of anybody around the world about these measures in Iran is not just their rights, but also their duties to mention to Iranian leaders that they should observe their human rights.
Yeah. Kenneth Katzman, is that a valid point there, that actually if Obama or the rest of the others don't engage here, they're effectively legitimizing a regime which could be cracking down on innocent protesters?
Well, look, I mean, you know, President Obama has been trying to reach out to the Iranian regime since he took office. And some of his critics say, yes, he's legitimizing Iran's support for terrorism. He's, you know, implicitly acknowledging Iran's right to enrich uranium. He's not been as tough on that as President Bush was. These criticisms are out there. But I think the issue is the Obama administration has made a calculation that thus far they do not see the regime being ousted as a result of these protests. And therefore, I think they've judged that it is not wise for the United States to come full force behind the protests if the protesters are not going to prevail anyway. Now, if we see new segments of society coming into these protests, workers, strikes, villagers coming in to join the protests, vast new elements of society joining, then maybe the administration calculation changes. But I think the thinking now inside the U.S. government is that this protest will either peter out by itself or it will be in some way put down, and it would not help U.S. interests to be fully square in front of in favor of the protesters right now.
I'm afraid we've run out of time on this interesting discussion, but thank you very much indeed to our guests, Mehrdad Konsari, also in London, Ali Granmaye, and in Washington, D.C., Kenneth Katzman. Thank you very much indeed, all three of you, for your time. And thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Inside Story. We do, of course, welcome your comments and suggestions. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.